Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the subcommittee, and friends and colleagues. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to speak to you today. I'm not here as a constituent nor as an expert on immigration policy. I'm here today as a practitioner and a bearer of stories, stories that were the inspiration for this project to review the policy landscape and inquire further and chronicle the travel challenges and experiences of human rights defenders in traveling to Europe. The goal of our project was to identify concrete actions that could be taken in order to ease travel burdens on the community of human rights defenders and civil society activists from around the world who seek to travel to Europe for purposes of professional network development, short respite, briefings and conferences and other professional and necessary activities related to their very important work. My work at the Sealy Institute in Prague is as a curator of fellowships and respites for civil society activists and human rights defenders from Russia and other countries of the former Soviet Union gave me insight into an overlooked issue of the challenges of human rights defenders in receiving short-stay visas to come to the European Union, and how this seemingly small challenge can sometimes result in catastrophic situations for those same individuals whom we intend to support. My role requires me to identify fellowship placements in host countries throughout Europe for activists and human rights defenders, and as such, I've had the opportunity to see visa issuing practices from across the EU and how they impact our fellows, which led me to the conclusion that the problems must be broader than just my own experience. This was the genesis of the project. This project was the combined effort of many people, particularly human rights organizations who helped with the distribution of surveys and with encouragement and insistence in refining the recommendations of our report. To be clear about the parameters of our project, we intentionally focused our research and recommendations on the practice of issuing short-stay or 90-day Schengen visas to EU countries. We recognize that there are existing mechanisms for emergency visas and temporary relocation visas for human rights defenders, but this was not where we focused our attention. As the term shrinking space for civil society has become normal parlance among NGO and policy sectors in the West, we feel that the direct impact of that shrinking space those who feel the direct impact of that shrinking space need to even more acutely keep strong connections with their colleagues in Europe and vice versa. And these connections have been thankfully sponsored by a myriad of programs and seminars, conferences and briefings and respites in the EU, often sponsored by the EU and EU member state grants. And the situation with shrinking space has also meant that the term human rights defender has necessarily broadened beyond our previous definition and become a much more flexible term, as it also includes those struggling for the right to association and freedom of speech in their home countries and everyday activities as civil society activists, where they can now face imprisonment or worse for the mere fact that they are participants in the third sector. This report, there are copies, I think, being circulated of the executive summary and the recommendations. It's a culmination of the analysis and research on EU visa policies and mechanisms, anonymous surveys of 123 self-identified human rights defenders from 10 countries of the former Soviet Union and Turkey, and in-depth case studies of the challenges faced by individual human rights defenders in applying for visas to travel to Europe. In authoring this report, it was our hope that our colleagues in much larger human rights organizations in Europe would be able to use this as their own advocacy tool to speak to policymakers at the EU and member state levels for improved travel conditions and access for their colleagues from countries outside the EU. I'd like to highlight some of the data from our anonymous human rights defenders survey that we found instructive and confirmed some of our assumptions about the community of human rights defenders and helped in the formation of our recommendations. We surveyed the community in 10 countries to understand their demographics and travel patterns. Of 123 surveys received, 43% of the respondents were women, 46% men, and 11% from the LGBTI community. 67.3% were between the ages of 25 to 44, in other words, young to mid-career activists and professionals. And what was confirmed from those surveys is that human rights defenders are not high earners and struggle to demonstrate their financial stability when applying for visas. 53% of those surveyed made less than 5,000 euros per year. They are frequent travelers to the EU, with 35% of those surveyed reporting more than 5 trips per year. and yet 53% of those surveyed did not hold a current Schengen visa. And 20% reported that having more than 5 Schengen visas in their passport in the last 5 years. And this indicates a pattern of issuing visas to limited to specific events. For example, a 6-day visa for a human rights defender to attend a 4-day conference. My colleague Arzu will touch upon this further in her remarks, but this particular practice is an extraordinary burden upon those who come frequently to Europe and are often issued visas by different EU states for various events. They face the consistent pressure of paperwork, the time required for application preparation, and the cost for visas over and over again. 68% of them have never had their visa fees waived by the inviting country, and 22% have paid for expediting or visa application assistance from third parties because of the time and the difficulty involved in the process for them. Of the biggest challenges cited by human rights defenders in obtaining visas, 66% said that the amount of time it takes to apply, including the time in gathering necessary documents and completing application forms. 65% reported that the cost was a challenge for them, and 22% cited the humiliation that they felt in this process. With respect to income, many of our respondents said that they were unable to provide sufficient financial stability or bank account balances high enough to convince the consulate that they could afford to travel, despite the fact that their travel, lodging, and meals are nearly always guaranteed and fully paid when invited to programs in Europe. This puts many defenders in a position of having to ask friends and family to lend them money to deposit in their accounts merely for the illusion of financial stability, if this is even an option, and often it is not. The question of marital and family status as a factor in visa denial or in proving intent to return is particularly relevant to the LGBTI community, many of whom cannot reveal their status for fear of reprisal or, in some cases, arrest or physical harm. As you're aware, in many countries where our surveys were conducted, NGOs have been liquidated or forced to operate informally, thus leaving a community of human rights defenders who are unemployed for practical purposes. Civil society activists and human rights defenders have resorted to being freelancers, which counts against them as well in their visa application review process. But I would like to return to the issue of mobility and stress its importance in understanding a critical need for this specific community. The pressures upon these activists has increased significantly in the past years, with a particular increase in pressure and threats to human rights defenders and activists from countries around the periphery of Europe. Having an open Schengen visa is an advisable strategy for human rights defenders in any case, but it seems that it is a luxury for only a few. I would like to also highlight the fact that this is a community that seeks to return home. They are, in my view, the front line, to borrow the name of the esteemed organization, who need the ability to retreat to Europe for their wellness, for decompression, for professional development, and for networking before returning to their daily struggle at home. They do not complain about the challenges of attaining visas because in their big picture, it's just one more thing that they must do. But it's one thing that we can do to alleviate at least some of their burden. In the recommendations that we passed around, you'll see a list of recommendations of what EU institutions, European NGOs, and member states can do in improving this situation. With respect to EU institutions, we believe that consistent efforts to harmonize internal and external policies is the key. And this can be started without radical legislative changes. Practically speaking, our main and most immediately actionable recommendation for EU institutions is to draft and include language about human rights defenders in the EU Visa Handbook, to grant facilitations to human rights defenders and their family members, taking into consideration issues such as financial stability, income, official employment, criminal records, and family ties. We also found the need for there to be increased monitoring in the availability of effective domestic remedies in the member states in relation to the use and sometimes misuse of the Schengen Information System, and remedies available to those in the system to correct or delete incorrect information for use in appeals against visa refusals. In closing, I want to say a few words of thanks. First to Professor Annalisa Meloni in London, who was instrumental in laying out the structural and legal landscape of our report. To my colleagues Carolyn Elliott Magwood and Christopher Lehman of the Seeley Institute, who are helping in editing the report. And finally, my friend and colleague Ali Firuz, who was a Sealy Institute Fellow, who helped gather case studies for this report. And once more, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about this important issue. We remain convinced that a few small adjustments and the promotion of a human rights-oriented lens through which Schengen visa applications can be viewed for human rights defenders would go quite a long way in easing access to the EU for this very important group. Thank you.